Today I'm going to be showing you how you can retro mod this Sony Walkman. I originally purchased this off eBay and it was bashed, damaged and well used. My thoughts were that I could change this into something that you can use today alongside with some of the things that you may carry around with you every day. That item is of course your mobile phone. You can listen to music, you can watch videos, you can make phone calls, you can even do your banking on this. But the one problem is all the accessories that comes with your mobile phone, especially when you're traveling. You need your charger, you need the charging cable, you need your wireless earphones, you need the earphone charger, you need a battery bank, you need the battery bank wire, you need the HDMI port and the HDMI cable. But what if we can get rid of all of his accessories and turn our Sony Walkman into the ultimate mobile phone companion? Sorry to drop this so early in the video, but I've only got 60 subscribers as we speak, and it would really help me out if you would like to subscribe if you like this kind of content. If you don't, feel free not to, but it really helps me out. Of course I don't have any sponsors and this is self-funded, so please enjoy the rest of the video. So Sony made the first portable music player, which was released in 1979, and it was known for their high quality as well as low cost. And Sony continued to manufacture their Walkmans right up until 2010. They initially planned 5,000 units, but instead they sold 30,000 units in its first 2 months of launch. So as I mentioned before, I got this Walkman off eBay and it was broken when I first received this item. When I took the cover apart, you could see all the surface mounted components and that legendary motor that they used to power the Sony Walkman and give you smooth sound. So I needed to plan how I'm going to fit all of my components in while keeping the original structure intact. So the items I bought for this build was a fairly cheap wireless earphone set that I got from Amazon. It was only about £15. And then I bought a wireless transmitter, again off Amazon. And this is quite easy to buy as a PCB, which is quite useful in terms of building this into the Sony Walkman. The other item that I ended up purchasing was a HDMI adapter that can connect to any USB-C port on most Android phones, but also you can get ones for iPhone as well. These are the components that I'll be taking apart. The first job was to take apart the earphones or the wireless earphones, and what I had to do was I first of all used a flathead screwdriver and I started to pry around the edge of the wireless earphones. Now you want to take your time while doing this, it can be quite fiddly. I ended up using a different tool that I had with my iFixit kit. The final assembly came out as a complete unit and it was just a magnetic lid. The next job was taking the battery power bank apart. This was much harder. I thought I could use a Stanley blade to cut around the plastic housing and somehow pry the assembly apart. Of course that didn't work out, so in the end I used a Dremel tool, and I'll be extremely careful doing this because you do not want to cut into that battery. It's very likely that you could potentially cause a fire and it is quite dangerous. So just take your time, and I slowly snipped away at the housing. I finally managed to cut the housing apart and release the batteries inside. As you can see, there was 3 lithium ion batteries, and then you have the power PCB board there to power on and give you 5 volts out the end. The next thing I did was wrap this in insulation to make sure that there was no chance of any short circuits or anything like that when it was mounted inside the Walkman. Make sure you wrap both the PCB and the batteries just to make sure there's no possible chance of creating any shorts, but of course leaving the connectors exposed. Now here, this is where I messed up because I realised there was no way I'm going to fit those batteries inside the Walkman, so that was a bit of a flop. I had to go back and rethink my plans, and what I decided to do was to get a slimline 5000 milliamp battery, and I also got a new power PCB board. I desoldered the USB ports from there and just kept the ports that I wanted. The next thing was I wired it into a switch and to the battery so that the PCB board would get power. The next job was to connect the wireless transmitter and also a USB-C connector, so that would connect to the wireless earphones, and connecting both of those together, it gave me power. I connected both of these up to the original USB-C port that I had desoldered originally, and I connected it up to mains to see if I was getting charged to the battery. The next job was to connect the display. This had actually fallen off the PCB board, but I managed to solder it on and it gave me a good connection, but I'll show you later on how I gave a solid connection to that. The next job was to design the caddy for where all these PCB boards and components will be housed, and finally sent to the 3D printer. So I ended up using extra strong PLA, which is much stronger than standard PLA, and I think the print quality came out really good, although I still need to get a PLA or filament dryer to make sure the quality stays consistent. I test fitted the earphones and the display inside the caddy just to see how it would fit, and I chucked all the PCB balls and everything else inside just to get a little test fit and see how everything would look inside the Walkman. As you can see, it's pretty tight in there and I didn't have a lot of space to work with. Now with the caddy in place, I then hot glue gunned the PCBs in place and the HDMI connector through the holes in the side of the caddy, and it all seemed to fit pretty well. Next I fitted the display at the top of the caddy, and that fitted in pretty well, but some of the wires broke, so I had to resolder them and used heat shrink to make sure there was no short circuits or anything like that. Now I powered it on just as a test, and as you can see, everything is working fine, just to make sure that there was no issues before I continue on with the assembly of the caddy and all the parts within there. Now I decided to hot glue gun the wires onto the back of the display to make sure they don't move around or lose connection, and that made sure that they would always be connected. The next thing was to connect all of the different components to the Walkman to make it look like that it hadn't been tampered with. Unfortunately, some of the buttons that I hoped to be able to I could use, maybe even the play button, the rewind button, I didn't find a use for, but I glued them back in place so that it would look like it was original Sony Walkman. I had to detach some of the components onto the back of the buttons, but that was fairly easy to do with a small screwdriver. Using a pair of tweezers and a hot glue gun, I glue gunned carefully all the buttons back in place, just to make sure that they looked as if they were originally in place on the Walkman. Now it was on to moving on to the final assembly of everything, including the caddy inside the Walkman and making sure everything fitted perfectly inside. Of course, this didn't quite work out as I originally planned. I connected the USB cable to the bottom to make sure it could still get through the caddy into the PCB board and give a good solid connection for charging, and that seemed to work pretty well. I also checked the HDMI connector and some of the other connectors around the caddy to make sure there was no obstruction in getting the cables in and out, including charging a phone using a USB cable. Now the next job was to remove some extra material. I actually had to keep cutting away material, and I kept going back to remove more and more material until I could fit everything inside the case. I had to remove the top to be able to allow the earphones to come out of the case to ensure there was proper clearance for the headphones. Now I just test fitted everything just to see if it would fit inside the Sony Walkman, and as you can see I've got fairly good clearance there for the earphones and all the other components, but of course the caddy was still loose inside, and also just getting a view of the top lid. Of course the top lid didn't shut because the battery was too thick, so I had to find a workaround for that. First thing is I decided to do a slider for the caddy. I didn't actually need the two sliding parts at the top, I just needed two at the bottom. I then made a housing for the battery, which I would actually use the belt clip on the back of the Walkman to house the battery in there. And finally I made a push button on the PCB board to turn the battery on. All of these parts were then sent to the 3D printer, and I printed the battery caddy and also the slider together in one print. And again, these came out really well. However, the dry really affected me here, and the print quality wasn't as good as it was before. Now for all the CAD files, what I'll do is I'll make them freely available on Thingiverse, and you can download that. I'll leave a link in the description below this video, so you can click on that link, navigate to Thingiverse and download the files. If you have a 3D printer, or maybe you could send it to a business or friend that may have a 3D printer to print these parts out for you, so you can build your own Walkman. Now I think the Sony logo on the caddy came out really good, and it gives it a good original look. I think it really finishes off the back of the Walkman and gives you something to look at. The next thing was of course connecting the battery outside the back of the Walkman, and I used a bit of heat shrink because I needed to extend the wires, and that was pretty easy to do with my heat gun. I've got a soldering iron and heat gun combined into one, and that worked really well to make sure that there was going to be no shorts on those wires. Now I needed to fit the battery holder onto the back of the Walkman. I used the threaded hole that was used originally for the belt clip, and I screwed it in and held the battery in on the back. Then I installed the slider that was again hot glue gunned in, and I then installed the caddy on top just to get a final test fit, and it seemed to be working really well. I could slide it out from the bottom and the top to gain access to the earphones, to the HDMI cables and to the power connectors on the bottom. The next thing was of course gluing in the wireless transmitter to wirelessly charge phones, and that was glued on top of the other PCB, or the HDMI PCB, and that was fairly simple to do. So here I needed to drill a hole, and you have to be really careful with where you drill that hole because it needs to be directly parallel to the button on the PCB board, and I measured that with a pair of calipers. Then I fitted the push button, and you can hear it clicking as I press it here.
You know, a victory is made up of thousands of failures as well, and it's just interesting to see.
So the final job to do here was to glue on the front cover, and what I actually did was I used double-sided strong tape that would hold the front cover in place, and then I used a hot glue gun to glue it in certain locations. And as you can see, I get access to the bottom, to the power connection, to the HDMI ports, and also I retested all of the electrical connections, making sure it was charging properly, making sure I was getting video output, making sure the wireless earphones are working, and making sure the wireless charging was also operational. This was a really fun build, and I think it's a really unique way to give you an opportunity to bring around a Sony Walkman and give you some use for it with your mobile phone, and I think it's a really cool idea and really fun to do. So if you want to give this a try, give it a go. Just be very careful with the battery. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, and leave any comments or suggestions of what I could have done better, and I'll see you in the next one.